The memory of that wedding in Abaddon lingered long after the drums went silent. It was the kind of afternoon where the sun softened its glare out of respect for joy, where the air smelled of perfume, dust, and steaming rice wrapped in nylon. Kunnel had arrived late, adjusting his borrowed agbada, unsure whether he belonged among the laughter and easy confidence of men who seemed to know where their lives were going. Fate, however, does not ask for readiness. When his eyes met Sada's across the crowded compound, time thinned. She was not the loudest woman there, nor the most adorned, but there was a quiet gravity around her, a stillness that suggested depth. As she laughed gently with the bride, Kunnel felt a pull he could not explain, as though something ancient had recognized him. Their first conversation was simple, almost shy. Words stumbled, smiles filled the gaps. Saad spoke of her fabric business, how she woke before dawn to secure good materials, how profits were carefully divided between food, school fees, and savings she prayed would one day become something more. Kunnel listened, struck by her discipline and the calm certainty with which she spoke of responsibility. He, who was still searching for direction, felt both humbled and inspired. Courtship unfolded without haste. Evening walks, shared prayers, conversations under flickering bulbs when power failed. Sada's faith was not loud, it was lived. She prayed not just for blessings, but for character. Kunnel found himself changing in her presence, speaking more honestly, dreaming more boldly. He told her of his fears, his desire to be a man of worth. She listened without judgment. He learned the rhythm of her life, the early market mornings, the patient haggling, the quiet satisfaction of a good day's sale. Her hands, though often tired, were never idle. They sorted threads, counted notes, and held his with a gentle strength that grounded him. One evening, sitting on the veranda as the scent of night-blooming jasmine filled the air, Kunnel confessed his biggest insecurity. He had no trade, no clear path, just a collection of half-finished apprenticeships and a heart full of uncertainty. He expected pity, maybe even a polite withdrawal. Instead, Saad looked at him, her gaze clear and steady. She told him that a man's worth wasn't in the work he had, but in the heart he brought to it. She saw not his failures, but his yearning to be better. It was in that moment Kunnel understood. Love wasn't about finding a perfect person, but about being seen for who you could become. He started a small delivery service on his old motorcycle, ferrying goods for market women. It was hard, dusty work, but for the first time, he felt a sense of purpose. Every kobo earned felt like a promise to Saad, a brick laid for the future he now dared to build. Their love wasn't a sudden fire. It was a seed they planted together, watered with mutual respect and trust. It grew slowly, its roots digging deep into the soil of their shared hopes. The proposal was as simple and profound as their courtship. There was no ring he couldn't afford, just a heartfelt promise under the same dim bulb where their best conversations had taken place. He asked her not just to be his wife, but to be his partner in building a life of meaning. Her yes was a quiet whisper, but it echoed with the strength of all the unspoken words and shared dreams that had led them to this point. Looking back, the wedding in Abaddon was just the first note in a long and beautiful song. It was the moment fate intervened, but their love story was written in the quiet moments that followed, the shared struggles, the unwavering support, and the profound discovery that the greatest loves are not found but built one honest day at a time. Marriage came quietly, without the flash and fanfare some might expect. There were no gold chairs, no hired musicians playing grand symphonies. Instead, there was just family, close friends, and a hope so thick in the air you could almost taste it. It was a modest celebration, filled with simple joys. In that moment, surrounded by love, Kunnel truly believed that life had finally opened its doors to him. For the first time in a long while, the world felt kind. The future, which once seemed so distant and uncertain, now felt possible, tangible, within his grasp. Peace, you see, has its own rhythm, a gentle, steady beat. And in the early days of their marriage, Kunnel and Saad learned to dance to it together. Their mornings began with whispered prayers, a shared, sacred silence before the world awoke. Even when money was tight, and it often was, they never lost their dignity. They had each other, and that was a wealth no currency could measure. Sada's faith was the anchor of their days. Her optimism remained a steady flame, a warm light that flickered but never went out, even when the cupboards were looking thin and bare. She believed, with every fiber of her being, that things would get better. Connell searched for work with a growing desperation. The weight of providing for his new wife was a constant presence, but he was never truly alone in his search. Sada's encouragement followed him like a protective cloak, shielding him from the harsh winds of rejection and disappointment. She would pack him a small lunch, kiss his cheek, and tell him, "Today might be the day." Her belief in him was unwavering, and it gave him the strength to face another day of knocking on doors that remained closed. Still, some nights were harder than others. Sleep wouldn't come. Connell would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, haunted by the creeping fear of failure. The questions would circle in his mind, relentless and cruel. Was he wasting Sada's devotion? Did her incredible loyalty deserve more than this constant uncertainty, this life of just getting by? He felt the heavy burden of her love, a gift he worried he could never repay. In those dark, quiet moments, when his anxiety was at its peak, she would sense his turmoil. She would reach for his hand in the darkness, her touch a grounding force. "Seasons change, my love," she would whisper, her voice a soothing balm on his troubled soul. "God's timing is not a punishment. It's a process. We just have to trust it." And her words, so full of simple, profound faith, would settle him. The tightness in his chest would ease, and he could finally breathe again. Then came the day that changed everything. When Saad discovered she was pregnant, a wave of pure, unadulterated joy erupted in their small home, like an unexpected, life-giving rain after a long drought. She wept, she laughed, and she prayed, all at the same time, a beautiful whirlwind of emotion. To her, this child was a promise fulfilled, tangible proof that their endurance, their faith, their patience was being rewarded. It was a sign from God that they were on the right path. Connell held her close, his own heart a mixture of elation and awe. He was overwhelmed by the sudden, immense responsibility that now rested squarely on his shoulders. This wasn't just about him and Saad anymore. A new life was coming, a life that would depend entirely on him. Their love, already so deep, deepened even further in that moment. But alongside that deepening love, the pressure intensified. The need to provide, which had always been a steady hum in the background, now sharpened into a piercing cry. It fueled his ambition, driving him with a new and powerful urgency. But what he didn't know, what neither of them could have known, was that this same ambition, born from love and desperation, was also sharpening his vulnerability, leaving him exposed in ways he could never have imagined. A new chapter was beginning, one that would test their faith, their love, and their resilience in ways they were not yet prepared for. Their home, though small, became a truly sacred place for them. Every single kick in Sada's womb was met with wide-eyed wonder. Every plan they made for the future was whispered carefully, almost like they were afraid that making too much noise might scare destiny away. Neither of them knew that joy, once it's announced to the world, can sometimes attract storms. Change rarely announces itself with a loud bang. Sometimes, it just slips in, disguised as an opportunity. When Connell received that job offer from Lagos, the sheer excitement completely drowned out any sense of caution. In their village, Lagos was spoken of like a miracle city, a place where men became successful overnight and poverty was just a rumor told by those who lacked courage. So, Connell packed his bags, filling them with ambition and dreams. He promised Saad it was only temporary, that this distance between them would only sharpen their future, make it brighter. He kissed her goodbye, his heart full of hope. The city of Lagos greeted him with an explosion of noise and color. The traffic snarled like living, breathing creatures. Neon lights blinked through restless, sleepless nights, and money moved fast, sometimes honestly, but sometimes not. Connell was a quick learner. He adapted. His confidence began to grow, fed by bigger paychecks and the admiration of people who had once completely ignored him. He started to enjoy being noticed, being seen. And then, Nkechi entered his life. She came in so effortlessly, her laughter trailing behind her like a sweet, intoxicating perfume. Where Saad was quiet and grounding, a gentle anchor, Nkechi was bold and exciting. She praised Connell openly, admired his new clothes, his stories of city life, his newfound sense of importance. These compliments became his fuel, and Connell drank them in deeply, thirstily. With every compliment, a small seed of pride was planted. When Kechi touched his arm, a jolt went through him that was different from the familiar comfort of Sada's touch. He started spending more time with her and her friends, staying out later, telling himself it was just for networking, for business. But deep down, a different story was being written. Each time Saad called, Kunal felt torn between two completely different worlds. Her voice, so familiar and warm, reminded him of humility, of patience, of prayer, values that now felt inconvenient, almost old-fashioned, in a city that rewarded speed and appearance above all else. Slowly, without really intending to at first, he began to delay his calls to her. He'd see her name on his phone, and a wave of guilt would wash over him, quickly followed by the justification, "I'm busy. I'll call her back later." But later often turned into the next day, and then the day after that. Lagos demanded his full attention, and he gave it willingly. He didn't realize that temptation thrives on neglect. The more he neglected his connection to Saad, the more space he created for Nkechi to fill. The conversations with Saad, when they did happen, became shorter, more strained. He'd talk about his successes, the promotions, the new suit he bought. But he left out the late nights, the laughter-filled dinners with Nkechi, the way her eyes lingered on him. He was editing his life, presenting a curated version to his wife, a version that kept his two worlds neatly separated. He told himself it was harmless. He was just enjoying his new life, his success. He was still the same Kunal, the man who loved Saad, the man who was building a future for their growing family. But the man who went to trendy clubs with Nkechi was not the same man who had whispered promises to Saad under the village moon. The city was changing him, polishing his exterior while slowly eroding his core. One evening, after a particularly successful deal at work, Kunal and his colleagues went out to celebrate. Nkechi was there, of course, shining brighter than anyone else in the room. The music was loud, the drinks were flowing, and the admiration in Nkechi's eyes was undeniable. She leaned in close, her voice a low murmur against the thumping bass of the music. "You're going to own this city one day, Kunal," she said. In that moment, under the flickering lights of the club, that felt like the truest thing in the world. He felt powerful, invincible. Sada's worried voice on the phone from that morning, asking when he might come home for a visit, felt like a distant echo from another lifetime. The distance between them was no longer just miles of road. It was now a chasm of unspoken words, secrets, and a life he was living without her. He sent more money home, as if the crisp banknotes could somehow fill the growing void, as if they could stand in for his presence, his affection. Saad, receiving the money, felt a mix of gratitude and a deep, gnawing unease. The money was good, it was helpful, but it felt cold. It didn't feel like the warmth of her husband's hand. She would hold the phone after their brief calls, the silence on the other end stretching into an emptiness that frightened her. She could feel him slipping away, like sand through her fingers, and she didn't know how to stop it. Back in Lagos, Kunal was caught in the current, and he wasn't even trying to swim against it anymore. He had convinced himself that this was what success looked like, what it felt like. He had forgotten that the most sacred ground he had ever known was not in the bustling heart of the city, but in the small, quiet home where a woman was waiting for him carrying his child and praying for a man who was slowly becoming a stranger. The storm had arrived, not with thunder and lightning, but with a quiet, creeping tide of neglect and temptation, and Kunal was letting himself be swept away. Distance isn't just about kilometers, it's about the choices we make. For Kunal, the distance between him and Saad grew with every excuse. First, it was the stress from work. Then, the network was always bad. Soon, Lagos was just too expensive. Each excuse was a brick in the wall he was building between them, and each one came more easily than the last. Saad, on the other end of the line, listened to his fading voice. She sensed a shift, a coldness she couldn't quite name, but her spirit felt it. Her prayers grew heavier, filled with a sense of desperation, and her nights were filled with restless dreams. Then, the message landed. It came without warning, without a single shred of compassion or explanation. It was a single sentence, but its edges were sharp enough to leave a permanent scar. "I'm no longer ready for this marriage." The words just hung there in the air, echoing in the deafening silence of Saad's apartment long after her phone slipped from her numb fingers. The screen went dark, but the words were burned into her mind. Shock was the first wave, a cold, paralyzing force. Then came disbelief. How could this be happening? How could the man who had promised her forever, the man who was the father of her unborn child, just give up? The disbelief slowly melted into a grief so profound, so all-consuming, that it felt physical. It was a pain in her chest, a hollowness in her stomach. She instinctively clutched her growing belly, a silent promise to the new life within her. Through a blur of tears, she whispered prayers, trying to piece together the shattered fragments of her heart, trying to understand how a love that once felt so strong, so real, could simply evaporate into nothing. How could he just decide it was over, with no conversation, no closure, just a cold, digital dismissal? Meanwhile, in Lagos, Kunal tried to silence the nagging voice of his conscience. He surrounded himself with noise, with distractions, with anything that could fill the void he had created. He plunged himself into work and late nights with friends, letting the vibrant chaos of the city swallow him whole. Nights blurred into hazy mornings, and the promises he had made to Saad became a distant, inconvenient memory. The marriage he once cherished, the future he had once eagerly planned, was now just a problem he refused to confront. What Kunal failed to realize was that with every ignored prayer from Saad, with every careless word he typed, he was planting seeds. And one day, he would be forced to reap the harvest of the pain he had sown. Pregnant and utterly heartbroken, Saad had no choice but to pack her bags and return to her parents' house. The journey back was filled with a thick, suffocating shame. Every kilometer felt like a mile, each one loaded with unspoken questions and the heavy weight of failure. The whispers started the moment she arrived. People in her community, people she had known her whole life, looked at her differently. Some stared with pity, their eyes full of a sorrow she didn't want. Others looked with a sharp curiosity, thinly veiled as concern, their whispers following her like a shadow. Each one was a small cut, but together they threatened to break her. Tears became her constant companion, falling silently as she went about her days. But even with the weight of shame and the sting of betrayal, Saad refused to crumble. She carried her pregnancy with a quiet dignity, a strength she didn't know she possessed. Her faith, though tested, became her anchor. In her darkest moments, she held on to the belief that God had not abandoned her. Shame has a tangible weight, and Saad felt it with every single step she took back into her childhood home. But beneath that weight, a new resolve was forming. She would not let this break her. For the sake of the life growing inside her, she would find a way to rise from the ashes. As darkness fell and the house settled into a quiet slumber, Saad would weep. Her tears weren't just for herself, but for the life she had once dreamt of, a future that was now just a ghost in her memory. She would lie awake for hours, replaying every moment, every conversation, searching for the exact point where everything went wrong. What had she missed? What had she done? The questions haunted her, looping like a scratched record. Yet, with the first light of dawn, she would rise. On her knees, hands resting on her growing belly, she would pray. Not for vengeance, not for things to go back to how they were, but for something far more profound: strength. The tiny, innocent life stirring within her became her entire world, her anchor in a storm that threatened to pull her under. This child was her reason to keep going, to endure the pain and uncertainty. Her parents were her silent guardians through this difficult time. They never once uttered a word of blame or disappointment. There were no lectures, no "I told you so's." Instead, they offered something much more powerful: their unwavering presence. Her mother would quietly prepare her favorite dishes, dishes from her childhood that tasted of home and comfort. Her father, a man of few words, would simply sit with her. His silence wasn't empty. It was filled with a deep, unspoken understanding that communicated more than any speech ever could. Through their quiet support, Saad began to understand a fundamental truth. Survival isn't always a loud, dramatic battle. Sometimes, it's the quiet, steady act of waking up each day and choosing to keep moving forward. It's the gentle rhythm of one foot in front of the other, day after day. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away in the bustling heart of Lagos, Kunal was living in a world of his own making, a world where he confused comfort with true happiness. Sharing a life with Nkechi felt like the ultimate validation of his success. Their apartment was a testament to it. gleaming surfaces, modern furniture, a view that stretched over the city. Laughter seemed to fill every room, and the flow of money felt as endless as the Lagos traffic. He saw it as proof that he had finally arrived, that he had made the right choice. But beneath this shiny, polished surface, a deep fragility was taking root. The foundation of their life together was built on something hollow. Nkechi, he was beginning to realize, was in love with what he represented. The success, the status, the provider of a certain lifestyle. She wasn't in love with Kunnel, the man. Her conversations were always peppered with mentions of luxury brands, exotic travel destinations, and the extravagant lives of other men who lived large. Kunnel would laugh along, playing the part, all the while trying to suppress the growing knot of unease in his chest. He was completely oblivious to the other life she was living, the one that existed in the digital glow of her phone screen. He didn't know about Chuka, a name that hung in the air during her long silences. He didn't see the messages that would flash on her screen, messages she would quickly swipe away or angle the phone to hide. He was so caught up in the illusion he had built that he couldn't see the cracks forming all around him. The day Nkechi left, the silence in the apartment was deafening. It was a physical absence, a void that screamed louder than any argument they ever had. The space felt utterly hollow, as if it had been stripped not just of her clothes and possessions, but of the very illusion he had clung to so desperately. He stood in the middle of the living room, reading the short, cold note she had left on the coffee table. He read it once, then again and again. The words blurred, his mind refusing to accept their meaning. Disbelief slowly curdled into a cold, sickening dread. A wave of panic washed over him as the full weight of his situation crashed down. He had built his entire world around her, and in a single moment, she had completely and utterly undone him. The pain that followed was merciless and all-consuming. His so-called friends, the ones who had been so eager to share in his success, vanished like smoke in the wind. The pride that had once puffed up his chest collapsed, leaving him feeling small and exposed. Lagos, the city that had once felt so generous and full of promise, now seemed hostile and unforgiving. Every street corner, every familiar sound, seemed to mock him. Sleep offered no escape. He would lie awake night after night, his mind a torture chamber, replaying his choices over and over. He finally understood, with a clarity that was both sharp and agonizing, what he had done. He had traded something real, something sacred, for something dazzling but ultimately shallow. Regret became his shadow, his constant companion. It whispered the hard truths he could no longer run from, the truths he had ignored for far too long. He had made his bed, and now he was forced to lie in it, alone with the ghosts of his decisions. This story is a powerful reminder of the choices we make and their consequences. The journey back to Abadan was a long, silent confession Kunnel wasn't ready to utter. Every dusty town and bustling bus stop they passed seemed to strip away another layer of the pride he had worn like a cloak when he first left. Lagos had promised him gold, but it had only given him scars. The city he had departed with such grand promises, leaving Saad and her family with a confident wave, now awaited his return with a quiet, knowing judgment. He could feel its gaze on him, even miles away. The city hadn't changed, but he had. He was a ghost of the man who had left. Hunger had been a relentless companion on his journey, carving away at his frame until he was a shadow of his former self. His once strong shoulders were now stooped, his cheeks hollowed out. But it was regret that had truly aged him. It etched lines onto his face that weren't there before, and it dimmed the light in his eyes. He started avoiding his own reflection. The man who stared back from shop windows and puddles on the street was a stranger, a cautionary tale he didn't want to read. He looked like a man haunted by his own choices, and he was. The weight of his failure was a physical burden, pressing down on him with every step. He arrived in Abadan as dusk began to settle, painting the sky in shades of gray and purple. And then, the rain started. It wasn't a gentle shower. It was a torrential downpour, as if the heavens themselves had decided to bear witness to his disgrace, to wash away any lingering pretense of dignity he might have clung to. The fat, cold drops soaked through his thin, tattered shirt in seconds, plastering it to his skin. The rain was unforgiving, mirroring the harsh reality he was now facing. There was nowhere to hide, no shelter from the storm inside or out. Each drop felt like an accusation, through the sheets of rain. His feet, seemingly with a will of their own, carried him through the familiar, muddy streets. They knew the way, even if his heart resisted. He found himself standing before a familiar gate, its green paint now peeling and faded, the once proud walls showing their age. Yet, it was painfully unchanged. The memories flooded back, so vivid they were almost tangible. This was the house he had once entered as a husband, full of hope and promises. He remembered the day of his wedding, the cheers, the laughter, the feeling of Sada's hand in his. He had been the man of the house, respected and loved. Now, he was just a beggar at the gate, a stranger to the life he had so carelessly thrown away. The gate was unlocked, as it always had been. He pushed it open, the screech of its rusty hinges echoing the protest in his own soul. Every step up the short path to the front door felt heavier than the last, as if he were wading through thick, viscous mud. The rain hammered down on his back, urging him forward, punishing him. He could see a warm light glowing from the living room window, a beacon of the life that continued without him. He imagined them inside, Saad, her father, perhaps sharing a meal, laughing, safe from the storm. The thought was a fresh stab of pain. He stood on the doorstep, water pooling around his bare feet, his body trembling uncontrollably. It wasn't just from the cold rain that had seeped into his bones. It was from a deep, primal fear. Fear of rejection. Fear of the look in their eyes when they saw him. What could he possibly say? The apologies he had rehearsed in his mind on the long bus ride now felt flimsy and inadequate. "I'm sorry," couldn't mend the trust he had shattered. "I was wrong," couldn't erase the pain he had caused. The words dissolved on his tongue, lost to the sound of the rain and the frantic beating of his own heart. He looked at his hand as he raised it to knock. It was thin, the knuckles bony, the nails dirty. This was not the hand of the successful man he had promised to become. This was the hand of a failure. His knuckles hovered over the worn wooden door for what felt like an eternity. He was suspended between the past he couldn't change and a future he couldn't bear to face. Taking a shuddering breath that felt like his last, he finally let his fist fall. The sound was dull, pathetic, almost swallowed by the storm. He knocked again, a little harder this time, a desperate plea. He waited, holding his breath. The world seemed to shrink to just that front door. He could hear faint movements from within, a voice muffled by the walls and the rain. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of terror and a flicker of desperate hope. Then, the lock turned. The sound was deafeningly loud in the sudden silence of his mind. The door began to open, slowly, creaking open a sliver of light that cut through the darkness of the porch. Time itself seemed to stop. The world held its breath with him, waiting to see who was on the other side, waiting for the final judgment to be passed. And in that sliver of light, a face began to appear. The door creaked open, each sound echoing the slow, painful beat of Connell's heart. And there she was, Saad. Time itself seemed to halt, catching its breath in the heavy, rain-soaked air. She had changed, and yet, she was utterly the same. There was a new strength in her posture, a profound quietness that hadn't been there before. Her eyes, once so open and full of light, now held entire sagas, stories that Connell knew he had forfeited the right to hear. Cradled in her arms, sleeping peacefully, was a child. The sight was a hammer blow, shattering the last fragile remnants of Connell's composure. The boy's breath was a steady, rhythmic whisper against the storm. His small face, relaxed in sleep, was a canvas untouched by the pain that had painted every corner of Connell's world. It was too much. Connell's knees buckled, and he collapsed onto the muddy ground. The cold rain seeped into his clothes, chilling him to the bone, but he barely felt it. All the grand speeches he had prepared, all the justifications, they all turned to ash in his mouth. Words were useless now. All he had left were tears and a truth so raw it felt like it was tearing him apart from the inside. Saad, he choked out, the name a painful whisper. Forgive me. I was so blind. His voice was lost in the sound of the rain, a desperate plea to a universe that had long since moved on. The silence that answered him was a physical weight, crushing and unbearable. It was a silence filled with the echoes of years of unanswered prayers, of quiet nights spent in lonely survival, of a strength forged in the fires of abandonment. In that deafening quiet, a devastating realization dawned on Connell. Forgiveness wasn't a transaction. It wasn't something you could demand or expect just because you finally showed up. It had to be earned, painstakingly, over time. And sometimes, no matter how much you wanted it, you were simply too late. Just as the silence stretched to its breaking point, a new figure filled the doorway. Sada's father. He stood there, his presence as solid and unyielding as a wall built from a lifetime of quiet restraint and righteous anger. Though age had stooped his shoulders, the authority in his gaze was undiminished. This was the man who had watched his daughter, his pride and joy, return home shattered. He had seen her swallow her shame with a dignity that shamed those who had wronged her. He had witnessed her turning to prayer when rage would have been the easier, more justified path. And now, he stood as the guardian at the gate, the unmovable barrier between his daughter's hard-won peace and the ghost who had come to haunt it. His voice, when he finally spoke, was not loud. It was measured, calm, each word carefully chosen. But they struck Connell with the force of a physical blow, the undeniable power of a truth held back for far too long. "The tears you are crying today," he said, his voice cutting through the sound of the storm, "are the same tears my daughter cried when you abandoned her." There was no malice in his tone, no overt threat, no dramatic accusation. It was simpler and far more devastating than that. It was balance. It was justice, stripped of all its theatricality, presented as a simple, undeniable fact. Connell's head bowed under the weight of those words, each syllable carving itself into his conscience like a permanent scar. 1,000 excuses, a million explanations, rose in his throat, but they died before they could be spoken. What was the point of explaining? What defense could possibly stand in the face of such complete and irreparable damage? The past was a wreckage, and he was the one who had caused the crash. All he could do now was kneel in the ruins, drenched in a rain that felt like heaven's own tears. Sod remained silent. Her quiet wasn't weakness, it was pure resolution. In that single, heavy moment, she made a choice. She chose peace over closure, dignity over a messy confrontation. She turned around, slowly. Her steps were firm and steady, and she shut the door. It wasn't a slam of anger, but a soft click of finality. A statement that this chapter was over. Outside, the world seemed to mirror the storm that had just concluded inside. The rain, which had been a gentle drizzle, suddenly intensified, lashing against the windows. Connell, left on the doorstep, fell to his knees. He pounded his chest in raw anguish as a loud crack of thunder split the sky, as if nature itself was passing judgment. The realization hit him, a painful, sharp, and undeniable truth. Forgiveness is not a right. It's not something you can demand or expect, and some consequences, some actions, are simply permanent. He had just discovered that some doors, once you allow them to close, are closed forever. Inside the house, a sense of warmth began to return, seeping back into the corners of the room, chasing away the chill Connell had brought with him. Sod held her child a little closer, feeling the steady, rhythmic thump of his tiny heartbeat against her chest. It was an anchor, grounding her firmly in the present moment, in this new reality she had just secured. She didn't feel a sense of triumph. There was no joy, no satisfaction in seeing Connell collapse out there in the rain. There was only a profound sense of gratitude. Gratitude that she had survived what once threatened to completely destroy her. She found herself whispering quiet prayers of thanks, not for revenge, not for seeing him suffer, but for the strength she had found within herself. Strength she didn't even know she possessed. She thanked whatever higher power was listening for her parents, who had stood by her like unshakable pillars through the darkest times. She was thankful for her child, this beautiful, innocent boy who would now have the chance to grow up without the shadow of bitterness, as long as she guided him well. In that moment, Sod understood something fundamental about justice. It doesn't always need to shout or make a grand scene. Sometimes, justice is quiet. Sometimes, it simply and gracefully restores balance to a world that was knocked off its axis. Outside, drenched and defeated, Connell eventually rose to his feet. He moved slowly, his body heavy, and began to walk into the night. Each step he took carried the crushing weight of his memories, the weight of every choice he had ever made that led him to this exact spot, on the wrong side of a closed door. He finally understood that he hadn't been defeated by imaginary enemies or by the witches his mother always warned him about. He wasn't a victim of fate or bad luck. He had been defeated by himself. The only person truly responsible for his own downfall was the man staring back from his reflection in the puddles. The city lights blurred ahead of him, a sea of indifferent, twinkling stars that didn't care about his sorrow or his pain. The world kept spinning, uncaring of his personal tragedy. And as he disappeared into the darkness, a silhouette swallowed by the night, the lesson of his story lingered in the rain-soaked air like a haunting echo. It's a simple, timeless truth. Love that is neglected will inevitably become loss. Faith that is betrayed will curdle into judgment. And karma? Well, karma never forgets an address. It always delivers. Saad, meanwhile, was building a new life, brick by brick. The days that followed were not about forgetting the past, but about integrating it. She learned that scars don't have to be ugly reminders of pain. They can be symbols of survival, proof that you were stronger than whatever tried to hurt you. She started a small business from home, pouring her creativity into something that was hers alone. It wasn't just about the money. It was about reclaiming her independence, her identity, beyond being a mother or a scorned partner. It was about being Saad again. Her parents watched her transformation with pride. They saw the light return to her eyes. The genuine smile replaced the strained one she had worn for so long. They saw her teaching her son not about hate, but about resilience. She would tell him stories, not of a villainous father, but of choices and consequences, of strength and self-worth. She was determined to break the cycle, to ensure her son grew into a man who understood respect, who valued love, and who knew that true strength lies in kindness, not in dominance. Years passed. The child grew into a bright, compassionate young boy who adored his mother. The house, once a place of tension and sorrow, was now filled with laughter and the smell of baking. It was a sanctuary, a testament to Sada's unwavering spirit. She had built a world for herself and her son that was safe and full of love. She didn't need the validation of a man's apology to feel whole. Her wholeness came from within, from the peace she had fought so hard to find. One day, an old, faded letter arrived. There was no return address, but she recognized the handwriting immediately. It was from Kunnel. Her heart didn't race with anger or anxiety. It was calm. She sat with the letter for a long time, unopened. She thought about the man who wrote it, a ghost from another life. She thought about the pain he caused and the strength she gained. She realized she had already forgiven him, not for his sake, but for her own. Forgiveness wasn't about letting him back in. It was about letting the poison out of her own heart. She took the unopened letter and walked to the fireplace. She watched as the flames consumed the paper, turning his words to ash. She wasn't destroying his apology. She was releasing herself from the need to hear it. Her story was no longer tied to his. Her peace was not dependent on his repentance. She had closed that door years ago, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually. As the last embers of the letter died out, Saad smiled. The balance was restored. Justice had been served in the quietest, most powerful way possible. And in the warmth of her home, surrounded by love, she was finally, truly free. This story teaches us that the end of one path is often the beginning of another. It reminds us that our greatest power lies in how we choose to respond to the hands we redealt. Saad chose dignity. She chose herself. And in doing so, she wrote her own happy ending. An ending not defined by revenge, but by resilience and self-love. The days that followed didn't announce themselves with any grand arrival. They just came, one after the other, and morning light would find Saad sweeping the compound, the rhythmic sound of the broom against the dusty ground a steady beat in the quiet air. Her neighbors, their curiosity simmering like a pot on low heat, would peek from behind their curtains. Saad saw them, of course, but she met every curious glance and every hesitant greeting with a calm, unruffled demeanor. She returned to her fabric trade with a fierce, newfound resolve. She was up before the first hint of dawn, catching the earliest bus to the bustling market, determined to reclaim her life. The other traders started to notice the change in her. They saw this quiet intensity, the way she bargained with a clear head and a steady voice, the meticulous way she ensured every debt was paid on the spot. Slowly, painstakingly, the whispers of pity began to fade, replaced by a growing hum of respect. This was respect she had earned, stitch by stitch, just like the fabric she sold. At night, when the world outside grew quiet, Saad would sit with a small notebook. In its pages, she wrote prayers that were a beautiful braid of gratitude and resolve. She asked for the wisdom to raise her son without a trace of bitterness in her heart. She prayed for provision, that she could provide for him without ever having to compromise her values. Most of all, she prayed for a heart that would not harden against the world, despite the pain it had shown her. Each answered prayer, no matter how small, a good day at the market, a kind word from a neighbor, a moment of peace, felt like another stitch holding her together, making her whole again. They named the boy Amoli. It means light, because even in the deepest sorrow, a light had found its way in. As he grew, his laughter became the music that filled their small home, chasing the lingering shadows into the corners and out the door. Saad learned the dance of motherhood with a profound humility. She leaned on the timeless wisdom of her own mother, listening to her counsel, but she also learned to trust her own instincts, that quiet inner voice that guides a parent. Her days were filled with simple rituals of love. She sang old hymns while she cooked, the melodies rising with the steam from the pots. She told ancient stories of clever tortoises and brave warriors while she skillfully braided her daughter's hair. She taught them the meaning of kindness not through lectures, but through her own actions, day in and day out. Emoli, her son, was a curious child. He started asking questions early, big questions. He asked about the world, about God, and, inevitably, about the father he did not know. Saad faced these questions with an honesty that was wrapped in a blanket of grace. "People make choices, my love," she would tell him, her voice gentle but firm. "And sometimes, those choices hurt other people. But what truly matters is the choice we make next." She made a conscious decision not to poison his young heart with blame or anger. Instead, she chose to fortify it with truth and resilience. Meanwhile, Kunal drifted. He left Abaddon with no real destination, becoming a ghost in his own life. He moved from one place to another, a man without an anchor. He took whatever odd jobs he could find, a day's labor here, a week's work there. He slept where he could, on mats in shared rooms, on benches in motor parks, learning the crushing weight and the true cost of his pride. Some nights, he would find himself praying, his words whispered into the darkness. On other nights, he would just lie there, staring at a cracked ceiling, bargaining with memories that played on a loop in his mind. He started writing letters to Saad, letters he knew he would never send. They were filled with apologies, with words he couldn't say out loud. He would fold them into small squares, tuck them into his pockets, and then forget they were ever there. Work, real work, came slowly, hesitantly. A mechanic took a chance on him, and for a while, he learned the language of engines and grease. Then, he found a job in a warehouse, the physical labor a welcome distraction. The sweat that drenched his clothes began to wash away the swagger he once wore like a second skin. Humility arrived, not as a guest he had invited, but as a permanent resident in the house of his soul. He found himself listening more than he spoke, a stark contrast to the man he used to be. When people asked about his past, he kept his answers brief, vague. The lesson had been etched into him, deep and permanent, like a scar that would never fade. Applause is fleeting, but character is what endures. It's what you're left with when the crowd goes home. The years passed, and Emoli grew into a bright, thoughtful boy. Sada's fabric business flourished, her reputation for quality and honesty spreading through the market. She had built a life, a good one, on a foundation of grace and hard work. Her home wasn't large, but it was filled with light and love. Kunal, on the other hand, had built his life back from the rubble. He was now a foreman at the warehouse, respected for his quiet diligence and his fair hand. He had saved money, found a small room to call his own, and learned to find peace in solitude. He still thought of Saad, of the son he had never met. The unsent letters had become a thick stack, a heavy testament to his regret. One day, a trader from Abaddon passed through the town where Kunal now lived. He recognized him. The news he carried was simple: Saad was doing well. Her son, Emoli, was the light of her life. Hearing this didn't bring Kunal pain, but a strange sense of peace. He realized that his choice, as painful as it was, had allowed her to flourish without the shadow of his mistakes. That evening, he finally took out one of his letters. But instead of folding it away, he placed it in an envelope, wrote an address he had memorized long ago, and walked to the post office. He didn't ask for forgiveness or a second chance. He simply wrote about the man he was becoming and wished her and her son a life filled with every happiness. He sent the letter not expecting a reply, but as an act of letting go, a final prayer sent out into the world. For Saad, the letter's arrival was a ripple in a calm lake. She read it, her heart a mix of old sorrow and new understanding. She showed it to Amoli, explaining that a part of his story had finally come home. She wrote back, a short, simple note. "We are well," it said. "We wish you peace." Two separate lives, forged in the fire of difficult choices, had found their own separate ways to the light. Time has a funny way of reshaping stories, doesn't it? What started as whispers of heartbreak and abandonment slowly transformed into something else entirely. In the village, the story of Saad and Kunal became a lesson, a cautionary tale. Mothers would point to Saad, not with pity, but with pride. "Look," they'd say to their daughters, "that is how dignity survives abandonment." Even the men, when they spoke of Kunal, did so with lowered voices. It wasn't mockery anymore, but a quiet warning about the paths we choose and the consequences that follow. Life, in its own relentless and surprisingly fair way, just kept moving forward. And Saad, she didn't just survive, she thrived. Her small business began to expand, and she found a new calling in mentoring the young women of her community. She became their guide, teaching them invaluable lessons she had learned the hard way. She taught them the importance of saving their money, of being financially independent. She taught them how to pray with real intention, not just with empty words. And most importantly, she taught them the crucial skill of discerning genuine commitment from empty flattery. Her laughter, which had been absent for so long, started to return. It was softer now, perhaps, marked by experience, but it was real and it was beautiful. Even her sister, Joy, who had always been so impatient for justice, began to learn the quiet strength of patience, watching Saad rebuild her life piece by piece. The years rolled on, and Amoli grew. He grew tall and strong, his name, Light, becoming a true reflection of his spirit. He wasn't just book smart, he was life smart. He learned to read the sky for signs of rain, a skill passed down through generations. He developed a knack for fixing broken things, from a wobbly chair to a neighbor's leaky roof. But his greatest skill was his ability to listen. He listened to the stories of the elders, to the worries of his friends, and most of all, he listened to his mother. He learned the unspoken language of her heart. On the day he turned 18, a milestone that felt both momentous and surreal, Saad gave him a special gift. It wasn't something new or shiny. It was an old, worn notebook, its pages filled with her familiar handwriting. It was the notebook of prayers she had written for him, starting from the day she knew he was growing inside her. Emoli sat down and read it in complete silence. As he turned the pages, tracing the words of love, hope, and unwavering faith, his eyes welled up. He saw the story of his own life, told through his mother's deepest wishes. When he finally looked up, his face streaked with tears, Saad smiled at him, her own eyes glistening. "You were loved," she told him, her voice steady and full of warmth, "long before you were even known." That evening, the celebration for his birthday was in full swing. Laughter and music filled the air as friends and family gathered to honor the young man Amoli had become. Across the way, standing in the shadows just beyond the warm glow of the lanterns, a man watched the scene unfold. He was older now, his shoulders stooped a little, his presence much quieter than it once was. It was Kunal. He didn't try to get closer. He didn't approach or call out. He just stood there, a silent observer at the edge of a life he had left behind. A faint, bittersweet smile touched his lips as he watched his son, a man now, surrounded by love. Then, as quietly as he had appeared, he turned and walked away into the night. It's a powerful thing to realize that some reckonings don't require a dramatic reunion. Some stories don't need a tearful confrontation to find their conclusion. Forgiveness, Saad had learned, is a lot like a river. It isn't a door you can just open or close. It flows where it needs to, finding its own path, guided by its own kind of wisdom. It washes over you when you least expect it, cleansing and healing in its own time. In the end, everyone learned their own profound lesson. Saad learned that survival isn't just about getting through the day. It can blossom into a beautiful, meaningful purpose. Her pain became her platform to empower others. Connell, in his solitary existence, learned that regret can be a powerful teacher, even if it can never restore what was lost. It taught him humility, but it couldn't turn back the clock. And Amoli, the boy named Light, learned the most fundamental truth of all. Light doesn't need to argue with darkness. It doesn't need to fight or scream or demand its place. It simply has to shine. You see, karma eventually found the right address. It always does. But grace, when you choose it day after day, moment after moment, does something even more powerful. Grace builds you a brand new home, right where you stand. Thank you for watching. If this story touched you, please consider subscribing for more tales of resilience and hope.